Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, 5'7". Yes.
I used to be.
You can understand that.
Yeah.
Right. Welcome everyone and glad to have you all. And out there, don't want to ignore my friends in Zoom and all of you could be with us today in this beautiful weather, and I appreciate it. It was a big competition, I know, in terms of whether you would come in person, and I appreciate it. The idea of this reign, of course, is one that will be clear to those of you who have been with me before because we talked about the late, great Simon de Montfort. And some of you thought about that during spring break. And I know, and it was hurtful, but we try to move on and understand that we honor Simon de Montfort. And now we're going to talk about, guess what, his nephew. I know that's weird. You say, I bet they wouldn't have had a nice visit. You're mighty right about that, because their relationship might have been nicer at another time. But by the time Simon de Montfort meets his maker, he and Edward had definitely fallen out. All of that is part of our story because Edward I is a very unique ruler and a very important one, particularly from our friends who have Welsh or Scottish ties, because those with English ties will say, gosh, he's so lovable. He's a wonderful person. He's one of my favorites. And yet, as much as we love the Scots or Welsh, that's for you, Marnie, we understand, of course, somebody has to win, Marnie. And sometimes people lose. So, all of this is to say that wars cost a lot of revenue and sometimes great popularity. But it is definitely a crucial time if we're interested in the combining of, notice I said combining, so as we don't think of domination, the idea of Wales and Scotland with England. And notice who I put last. Yes, just so nobody's feelings will be hurt. Why the name Edward? Well, obviously, I mean, you don't have to go on quiz show to figure that one out. I mean, who is the greatest of the Edwards? Edward the Confessor, right? I mean, I think everybody would know that. But who was Edward's father? Well, that's what's so interesting when you think about his father and his son, both of who are also kings. And you think they were not great successes, were they? No. So we understand, of course, when we do think about Edward the First, we are talking about one of the great rulers. He was, in fact, when he became king, 35 years old, which I think we will agree was for a king of the day not a bad age to be. To say that he was very experienced at the age of 35 is to make sure that we are aware of how much responsibility he had to take for his poor father. If you think back to what we talked about in the day of Simon de Montfort, I mean, at one time, Edward, we call him the Lord Edward, he probably liked Uncle Simon. Oh, thanks for teaching me about equestrian skills, Uncle Simon. I really appreciate that. Trying to create a love connection here. But, obviously, it's my throne and you're a blankety blank usurper. So we lost that loving feeling, right? So all of this is to say that during Henry's last years, basically Edward was taking over, assuming most of the authority because his father was, like we would say now, dysfunctional. I mean, he was in part a sort of prisoner of Simon's regime, you'll recall. All of this is to say now he is ruler. But interestingly, he was ruler from a distance because during his father's last years, he went on a crusade. I mean, it was what people did back then. Went a crusade, didn't get a lot done. They retook Acre, which sad now, but yeah, that was part of it. He meant to go with his uncle Louis, aka Louis the Ninth, or St. Louis, as you would. All of this is to say he had a busy time and more or less went to Italy, spent time. His father died in 1272. And basically, he got back in 1274. So basically, after his father's death, Edward was coming into a relatively stable situation. And what a wonderful change from his father. It's not like you want to say anything ugly, but it was just that Edward seemed so attractive in so many ways. Says I know, great warrior. He was, I guess you'd say, trilingual, because I assume he had rudimentary English skills, though I wouldn't think you would need them too much. Just speak to serving people or others, because obviously we were speaking French or writing in Latin. So all of this is to say that he is one of the educated rulers, and it's hardly surprising being the son of Henry III. We know that he was a great warrior, having gone on crusade, having led the English forces when Uncle Simon said goodbye to this world and entered another world, whichever it may be. All of this is to say that he was also skilled, and this is why we have these textbook terms, I always call them the English Justinian. Now, if you were to go to a history convention, Lord love you, and you had to, I know, and hang around with a bunch of history people, and then you would say, you know, he was the English Justinian, and everybody would go, get back, because everybody would know that. We could put it as a fill in the blank. You know, you wouldn't have to say, gosh, can we phone a friend or something like that? You wouldn't need to, because everybody knows that in history land. The English Justinian, because 527 to 565, not to be have a date fetish, but there you are. That is Justinian, and of course the famous law code. Is Edward on that level? Well, the English seem to think so. So let's go with them and say we are very, very impressed with what he did in law and administration. And some of us will remember King John, and be aware that was his uncle. So maybe love of the law runs deeply in the blood. Whatever the case, he was a great legal and administrative expert when he took time off from fighting. right? I mean, because this is the Middle Ages, we fight. That's part of it, and we don't give peace a chance. We are, yeah, get it. I knew you would. The idea basically then is that this is why we are so interested in administration. We do need the filth of lucre and a lot of it. So, where have we got wars? Well, obviously the French and the Scots. When we don't need Mel to tell us about that, but we will soon enough. And of course, the Scots. We'll start with the law aspect simply because of what we call statutes, because from classical times, the law had been thought of as immutable and unchangeable. And so the idea of laws as being enacted was fairly shocking, I guess you would say, revolutionary. So that's why they call them not laws, but statutes. But statutes are royal enactments, shall we say, had now obtained the force of law, not merely an interpretation, but a law in and of itself. So that's why they call it statute. All of that, I think, is interesting for that particular period, but obviously Edward I is considered one of the great people of this period. And starting with this statute of Gloucester, and you say, why Gloucester? He happened to be there. That's the truth. It'd be like the statute of Opelika, statute of Smith Station. You never know, what people are doing or where they are, but now you do, because when the royal court was there and he issues this, it will be a very important consideration. And I want you to get a chance to look at it as I talk about it. The franchise, meaning, and some of you remember your Latin studies, warranto, by what license or franchise. In other words, how do you claim to have this right? Well, you said, well, I go to Opelika, to the Lee County Courthouse. Well, in the past, they didn't have all the niceties we do. Poor Warrento is going to set up this idea of obtaining a franchise. You want to rule over this land? You need a franchise. You say, well, that sounds like great progress. Really? Yeah. And you start thinking about it. What are you going to need if you do go to our lovely Lee County Courthouse? A credit or cash? We take both. And you say, but you make it so vulgar, so cheap. Well, think about it a minute. Have you ever gotten anything free there? Probably not. If you have, tell me about it. The idea, though, is this statute of Gloucester is going to make people, it's going to force them really into obtaining warrants. All of this is so interesting to me because in the past, you just asserted rights. And when the king's agents went to one particular individual, and the story goes that he chased them out and said, I'll show you, probably a little irascible, I think is the word. He said, I'll show you my warrant, my franchise. And it was the sword his ancestor had carried with William the Conqueror. By cracker, that's my right. That's the idea. But now people are claiming this on the basis of having an authorized franchise. And again, how do you get the franchise? You pay fees. And again, that's just a reality of modern life. And let me add literacy. Ah, yes. Because the good old days when it didn't matter, reading and writing, it's only a bunch of old monks, that type. Now, that is going to be a necessity, isn't it? You or someone else who will keep records for the royal government, in addition to the bishop's government, who's ever it was. That's what I think is so interesting about this. And of course, lots of people like our noble who's chasing out the royal officials. They're unhappy. I guess a lot of us are unhappy by change, but the progress of literacy, record keeping, and royal administration will grow. Is it to try to make things more efficient and effective? I think it's because of money, personally, but maybe that's just me. Statute of Mortmain is another way we can get money. Mortmain, as many of you will know, means dead hand. And dead hand means that we want to leave the church a lot of land. Oh, you're such a wonderful person. Maybe you're afraid of you're going to hell or purgatory, whichever goes faster. Yeah. And mortmain means that all of that land goes to a non-ending source. You give the land there, you can't say, well, the family will last a while and then it'll die out. I think not as long as there's a world. Till judgment day comes, there's going to be a church. So the idea of dead hand means that if someone gives land, and people did it all the time, and that's why the church had so much land, whether you're speaking of the local diocese, the local parish, whatever it is, the donations of land would now, according to Mortmain, be illegal unless you first of all took out the grantor and the person who you held the land from had given his authorization. In other words, all of this will have certain sorts of financial repercussions as well as the government. Now, here's a word you can use, and people will be so impressed. Just go home and say this. If you don't behave, I'm going to sub-infudate you. And you think, oh no, yes, sub-infudation. And gosh, people will be so impressed. You're Ollie tuition at work. Yeah, I mean, that is the idea of sub-infudation. You have this land, and you say, well, maybe this is more land than I really need. So I will let this person have it as my vest. And then that person, I guess, might be a graduate of the Auburn Business School, and he's thinking, well, why don't I just split up my land? And then you know what you've got, a sub-infudator. Yeah. And it can keep on getting smaller and smaller. Yeah. However, there's the royal government. And it's named here, the statute, by the two introductory words in Latin, quia cores, meaning that there can be no further divisions. In other words, if you want to provide the land to someone, then you drop out. You're no longer involved. Your Lord becomes the Lord of that person. If you stop and think about it, you'll see that. I mean, how, I guess you call it the feudal tree, Feudal. The idea is that it would just keep on level after level, because we know we've talked about those family trees. Oh, beautiful family trees. But this would prevent that. And the reason is obvious, because if you think family genealogies get difficult, think about how sub-infeudation can be very, very complex. Meanwhile, there are financial benefits, because by taking someone out, there are no longer any costs involved. The seller is out because you've sold your rights, more or less, to any involvement in that property. The Parliament is another important aspect of what Edward first did, and I can imagine the spirit of Simon de Montfort crying out, "What about me? What about me?" Yes, it's true that we want to give the devil his due, because it was Simon de Montfort who, during that period, and again, you don't have to memorize dates, 1264 to 1265, when he was in charge. But during that, there was not anything that I think of as being regular. It's just that during the times, in keeping with the provisions of Oxford, because remember, the king was King Henry III and the Lord Edward. They were involuntary guests of this regency. It's not like they were saying, "Gosh, can we help? We love you and appreciate you." I don't think anybody could be that. Possibly, like a Manchurian candidate, you're just repeating some sort of propaganda. I don't think there's any of that. I think basically they are there in, I assume, comfortable captivity. But Simon de Montfort's running it with, and it's a short time, isn't it? I mean, it's less than 2 years. But he is bringing in nobles, wealthy people, I guess, Rotarians, Chamber of Commerce, well-to-do folks, and people of significance. And he's saying, "What do you think I should do?" And, as usual, people are fussing and carrying on. You have to be patient. All of this is to say that I'm not sure the Lord Edward, once he became King Edward I, would say, as I call this meeting of Parliament, I want to thank my Uncle Simon for all the fine work he did, and I really appreciate it. I don't think so. It's like he is burning in hell, damn him. That's why we split him up. Sounds like a zoology lab. Yes. So basically, I don't think Edward I is going to give him some credit, but we'll do it. We'll say that Edward I must have utilized this idea of the parliaments. And some of you will remember in the winter we talked about parley to speak, and the idea of the parliament, because it goes all the way back to the feudal idea of the curia regis and all the rest. How are you going to rule if you don't have the biggies of the reign? working with you, not necessarily agreeing on everything. Did you notice this principle of Justinian? And I always wonder, in as much as most righteous law of the emperors ordains what touches all should be approved by all. This is not to say, and you're too sophisticated for me to imagine that anybody would say, oh, democracy, isn't it wonderful? No, but theoretically, it's not. So theoretically, we of the working orders, we are being represented by these folks who are there with the ruler. So that was the idea. And of course, that will be part of what Edward would do. But we understand, and you understand, and I understand that much of this has to do, and I don't mean to be mercenary or it's all about money, but that does play a very important role. I care very much about the feelings, but I would like a gift, if I could, a little gratuity here and there. So this is the famous illustration. Modern historians, well, modern as in 20th century, will call it the model parliament, but it's a model that didn't occur regularly, but it's sort of like, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And it's more like, again, I just got so caught up in dates, 1789, well, everybody gets that, but yeah. The idea of the three orders. And you say, gosh, I wonder who made that up. I bet you there was a clergyman involved because the first estate was the clergy. And I don't mean any Baptist and Methodist, see. And I don't even mean Orthodox. They can go to hell too. We're talking Catholic all the way. And that's the first estate. Okay. You see him over here. Probably the ones in black are abbots of monasteries. Because you think of monasteries, oh, some tiny little place. And no. We're talking about big. And the abbot's the CEO, not to be vulgar, but yeah. Bishops similarly are major figures. I'm just saying that because I think when you talk about your first estate, you're talking about movers and shakers. Are some of them, I don't mean to be hurtful, pluralists? Yes, sometimes. But holding manifold positions did not prevent them from showing up at the post office. I think you got a check for me. Yeah. So these livings make them very, very important. And then opposite the nobility, and then in the back, you know who? The rich folks. Yeah. Chamber of Commerce. Yeah. So you say, but I'm a peasant. Can I go? No, but you can work. I think that's where you need to be. And I'll tell you if you need to something to know. The front folks, the archbishops of Canterbury and York, and of course, forever fated to be number 2. Yeah. Reminds you of the old Avis commercial. Yeah. You know, number 2, but I think it's still good to be Archbishop of York, right? But not as good as Archbishop of Canterbury. And meanwhile, of course, in addition to having these royal officials, We have, of course, our special little friends, meaning, of course, the late great Llewellyn of Wales. I know, you of Welsh descent. You'll understand. I wanted to bring that up so that he gets credit. He's the little fella, and you say, well, I wonder, was he on a diet or something? No, I think that's a way of saying that the Welsh are subordinates. That's a nice word to the English. And then, of course, can I call him a kinglet of Scotland? Yeah. I mean, that hurts, but yeah, that is, as far as the English are concerned, the model. That you have the 3 estates and you have their advice given to the king, and the king is there with his subordinates. All of this 1295 is to say that obviously in later times it didn't work out that way. You can cut on any channel and see the British Parliament today and be aware that it's bicameral. But this, in addition to the Estates General, which went on, of course, until the revolution of the 18th century, would be this kind of tricameral business. Over and over, he would struggle for what today we lovingly call fundraisers. Many of us know about it because, do you know, I bet you know this, we actually have a major in it now. I mean, in the old days, we used to major in Latin or geometry, things like that, but now we have majors in fundraising. Because that's how big it is. And this, of course, is so true because during these years, we're talking about the late 1270s, 1280s, 1290s. And the last time I looked, and you can ask your friends at the Pentagon, it's expensive to have a war. I've heard that. Yeah. So if you want to have a war, be prepared to pay for it. And who's going to pay for it? Well, it's not coming out of my revenues. I'm king. It's coming from you. And so the idea is that it seems like, and he does it more effectively than many rulers, but there's always a fundraiser. And we're not talking about selling Krispy Kremes either. We're talking about some serious levies. And part of that, and I don't want to be entirely cynical and say that's completely the basis for the statutes and the legal changes, but I am saying that the necessity of constant revenue enhancers will be essential if we want to fight, because I don't think, war, what is it good for? I've seen this. I can't imagine Edward First singing that song. Yeah, no, this is all about fighting. Fighting who? Well, who you got? I mean, we've got Welsh, we've got Scots, and last but by no means least, the French. We love to fight them. Yeah. If ever we consider it. But finally, I guess people get so sick of it that he's forced into what's called confirmation of charters. And basically, this is like you take an oath, and you know how oaths are. I would never call anyone here perjury. You say, well, I could just do a couple of years in the reformatory, or where could I go? I don't know. Lee County Justice System. Yeah, but people don't seem to take it as seriously. But if you were to ask, you go to confession and say, I was thinking about perjuring myself, and say, well, no purgatory for you, you're going down. We understand the seriousness. Am I saying people never lied? Of course I'm not. But you understand the confirmation of the charters, what's supposed to make one feel that you have double sworn to following what grandfather Johnny said. Yes, Magna Carta. Because, Henry promised it too. And you say, what are promises worth? Well, again, the significance of oaths and oath taking and the belief that you'll pay for it in the hereafter if you lie under oath. Remember, under oath, like in all those murder mysteries, and when they have the trials, nobody ever says, I don't believe in oaths. Yeah, you can't do that. You have to take it. And they don't say anything about going to hell, but I'm saying it right now. I'm saying it because that's 13th century, so I can do that. But all of this is now to understand why the Welsh, I can't imagine bringing up Edward I. If I was hanging out with some Welsh buddies saying, we all appreciate what Edward I did. And we think about Llewellyn. He got in that painting of the model parliament, but we also understand that there was an English heavy breathing on him in terms of his leadership of Wales. I know many of you have been to Wales and you realize it's wonderful. Well, it's lovely, and to see I don't have to push tourism. Well, tourism, I'm sure you'll enjoy it, but I'm just saying that, in fact, the English had already moved significantly into that area, and Llewellyn and his family had tried to play, let's all get along and we can be your friends, and let's not hurt each other. Let's have an Anglo-Welsh pact. And I don't think the English were ever buying it, but Llewellyn played his hand too skillfully, and so basically Edward snatched it away from him after some very serious conflict. And as they used to say in the old Crest commercials, look, Mom, no more Prince of Wales. That was gone, as you know. And the last time I looked, there was a nice young man who was Prince of Wales, and he looked mighty English to me, right? William. The idea, in other words, being that not without some unpleasantness, the Welsh lost the right to that title. And you're aware that probably since the 1970s, gosh, that long, there have been all kinds of movements to bring back the Welsh language. Take a class in that. You wish you stayed in Japanese and Chinese, yeah. It is not like French or Spanish, I'm telling you. So you've got that. And of course, just the idea of the Welsh being totally dominated by the English has continued to be an area. But it is interesting when you go through and see all the castles that were built during this period. And again, that takes money. And the castles, of course, were meant to more or less overawe the Welsh people because this will be dominated in a way that I suppose those of Irish ancestry will see a later period of English rule. But at this time, I just wanted to focus here on the Welsh and to realize how much this project of domination by the English of Wales would take. I mean, Wales is not that large, I'm sure you'll acknowledge, but the nobles of the area of England that bordered on Wales, of course, they were anxious for Edward to move on it. So I'm sure they gave him great momentum. Here we have Cardiff. And I remember once I was taking students to England. Gosh, I guess we were landing at Gatwick. And she said to me, she said, you know what I'm going to be doing? I said, well, we'll all be going to Oxford, then we'll see London. And she said, I don't know about you, but what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to go see Welsh castles. I'll never forget that as long as I live. I thought that was so brave because I don't know if I would have done it, but all by her lonely. I mean, not another student, she just took off. So we had the British Rail pass. So she wanted to see all those castles. And I thought that was so interesting, very adventurous. But that is a very, very important part of Welsh history. I guess you would say having to do with the Welsh and the English and their interesting relationship. Yeah. I mean, I want to love you, but it's hard sometimes. Yeah, I know. So that is the way that it was supposed to have been. But I always think, I wonder what was the purpose. I don't think it was to have a comfortable life. I've always said that, you know, if I were into real estate or something of the sort, I would not think I would, you know, be interested in selling castles because that's truly Disney, don't you think? I mean, because it's not comfortable, it's not private. And think of disgusting, yes. So that's so much for your castle and, you know, princess and everything is, and not at all. Yeah, yeah. No, look at him. There's my, no, that's just heartbreaking because I think, where is my 35-year-old tall man that everybody's going, wow, the Lord Edward's now the king. Something happened. Yes. I can't even remember the name. Do you remember the name? He played the role, and I think he died shortly after there. But it was I mean, it was a great role, but these display him at a time when I guess this would have been the late 90s, 1290s, early 14th century. And he was really anxious to move into Scotland and keep pushing north, as they would say, and having quite a bit of difficulty because he was anxious to make a statement here. Whether he thought he could take all of Scotland, because if you've been up to the Highlands, that's a pretty large place if you want to take it. And he had lots of other projects too, so it's not as if everything is about Scotland. That's part of the problem we have when we see movies, especially this one. We often think, this is all that we got going on. Well, we know that's not true at all. That King Edward was very busy in France and so forth. But Balliol, and then, of course, the famous William Wallace, who I think became more famous than he ever was in real time because of Nell. Yes. And then Robert Bruce and members of his family. All of them, I think, if you were sitting in Edinburgh right now and weren't with me, I'm glad you are. But if you were in Scotland right now and you were taking a course in Scottish history, I guess they still have that. But if you were, these would probably be fill in the blanks on your test. Intro to Scottish history or something like that. I'm not completely sure, but I'm thinking more or less this would be very, very significant. If you've read the book or had that opportunity, and I hope some of you have, I mentioned that on the syllabus, do I not?
Yes.
These are those last chapters, because it will go into the details of how Balliol was going to be, I really love you. And I know people will say a lot in politics, but basically saying like, when Edward demands he comes to London to be a subordinate, ratemyscottishking.com doesn't do well. No, that will be a serious problem. All of this is to say that then Wallace will have his time at the end of the 1290s. And, well, we won't go into the movie. I'm not a movie critic. I'll admit it. You know more about this, but there was sort of a contrivance of history, shall we say, that I was constantly having to correct in class. But all of this is to say that by the time of the king's death in 1307, he had not been able to reduce Scotland to his rule. I thought it was very interesting, though, the statement that was made. And it makes me think of something I want to tell you all in a few minutes. It's that the Scottish king, as is noted, will ultimately be the one in the 17th century who will become king of England. And of course, everybody knows I'm talking about James the First, and you say, did the English love him? Well, I'm not so sure. I don't think so. I would not have been, were I James the First, ever thought, gosh, I'm so popular, people really love me. It's a hard act to follow if you follow Elizabeth, right? And talking, and I love to listen to Scottish people talk, but English people, no. So that's a whole different dynamic. So let's just note that they have maintained their differences, and they've dealt with, I hope they've dealt with some of the pain that has been caused. But the campaign to go north is one that will continue for the kings after Edward, even as the Pentagon bills have barely been coming in for the last year. You know how people get behind in their payments? Yeah, that's what I'm talking. I'm talking about, I do not understand how much money he was laying down in terms of costs. And of course, we've got Scottish bills, we've got Welsh bills, and of course, we have a veritable academy of legal experts figuring out how can we milk more money out of the church and various other institutions. Because, of course, something many of us love very much, the fruit of the vine. Yes, we love wine. And we understand that, not knocking California, we all love California and New York. Yeah. Kroger probably sells some very fine local vintages. Just saying, I don't want to get in trouble. But there are many good French wines too. Just saying. All of this has to do, of course, with why can't the English just go home and let it go? You know, we lost Norman, and that was a lot of pain. We've gotten some help with that to deal with those particular issues. The loss of Normandy way back under Grandpa John, remember? Yeah. And that was very painful. We love Normandy, don't we? Yeah, Frank. But we want to keep the beautiful Bordeaux and the surrounding area. Don't ever forget that. And just you're very close to Spain. I don't sound like a tourist, pushing tourism. Yeah. But all of that area around Bordeaux has that amazing English connection. They actually have the Anglican Cathedral there, believe it or not. Fun little ollie facts. Yes, it's not try that out. Not everybody knows that about Bordeaux. But there is an amazing kind of English connection there. All of this is to say that the English did not want to give it up, even though perhaps in retrospect, centuries later, they'll say, maybe we should have just let it go. But, you know, that's not the kind of thinking that goes on historically, is it? At the time, they thought it was very significant. Frank, I believe you mentioned Philip IV the Fair. Why was he known as the Fair? Well, Philip the Handsome, because it's a use of French words. I mean, Philippe le Bel, but you can't say Philip the Beautiful. So this is all a matter, I guess, of linguistics about how you're going to use certain words. And what does it mean? Does it mean he wasn't very bright, but he looked mighty good? No one has ever explained that, because sometimes we think of good looking folks as not being smartest. And maybe that's not, I mean, it's nice to be good looking. I mean, I wouldn't, I know that, just I know people like that. But I'm not going to say they're going to make a B in my class. I think there's some A's who look nice. And I think that's good. Yeah, it's good to have it all. But seriously, he had been, of course, a very significant Philip IV in French history. And of course, if you're ever on a Jeopardy, and the question is about who was Philip IV's grandfather, I can just see your fertile minds just saying, I know, let me. Or you can always phone a friend, because I'm here for you. St. Louis. And yes, that's right. And that's why, yes, the title saint. Because King Philip had some important friends. And you know what important friends can do for you sometimes. My granddaddy was really a great man. And I would love to make a contribution. Oh, really? Let me get that information. Yeah. And the rest is financial and canonistic history. That is the way it happens. And of course, as Frank mentioned, that will be Boniface VIII. Meanwhile, Edward I and Philip IV had their problems. They were related. I don't want to get into a Thanksgiving thing that we're all there. Oh, I think we're related. Well, of course they were. Medieval royalty, if you stop and think about it, basically Louis IX was married to the sister of Henry III's wife. You don't have to know that. Okay, it won't be on the test. But just importantly, understand in terms of power politics and interest in gaining and holding on to territories, that helps you not at all. It simply means we get together and we have really nice parties. Yes, there's a lot of wine and a lot of feasting and probably a lot of entertainment. So they do plenty of that, don't you worry, in addition to everything else. But, in the midst of all this celebrations, they're thinking about what do we do when the party's over? Well, you know what? We go back to war. And how do we manipulate the situation to suit us? By doing to the English similarly what they had done to the Scots, and what that will be. Think about this a minute. The reason that Edward I fell out with the Scots, the King of Scotland, Balliol, was because he demanded that the King of Scotland come down to London to show submission. I'm fine in Edinburgh. Thank you very much. That being a little sassy. And that is the same thing the English are doing here, Edward, because Edward is technically a vassal of Philip for the lands, the wine, don't forget your wine, and he is summoned to Paris. Edward doesn't want to go. There are trumped up charges against him. And he doesn't come. And of course, you know what happens. Because everything is dependent on people holding up their word, fealty and homage. You promised. And now you know what you are, a perfidious. Yes, you are a perjurer. I'm going to talk. You may need to damn perjurer. Yeah. So I can use harsher words, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to tell you that this was considered very nice because basically during these mid 1290s, the French troops are moving into Bordeaux, and you think this is some sort of 1790 kind of thing, and everybody's singing the Marseillaise. No, I think they could have done without both of them, but they didn't have a choice. So for a time, the French will occupy Bordeaux. And there will be problems. Problems meaning, I wonder if there is any way we can work out our problem. And again, I always think like, if you're Edward or one of his officials and you're saying, gee, I wonder if I need to turn to the French file or the Scottish file, the Welsh file, or the law school file, and see who can help me with all this. He had quite a bit on his plate, I think you will agree. So where do we go when we have problems? Well, Frank knows. We go to the Vicar of Christ. You say, wow, looking good. For a man who's bound to hellfire, I think he looks, I would say, damn good. Yes. Seriously, I don't know for sure. I don't want to say Dante was completely right. I mean, I love Dante, love Italians. Florence is a wonderful place. So I don't want to get any trouble. No, you didn't hear that. Yeah. But the idea is Boniface VIII, he was a pope. He was a Simoniac. He was a pluralist. Let's just say he had a lot of aspects that were not suitable to be the leader of Christians on earth. Now, I'm not being judgmental. I think history is pretty much said I'm correct on that. He had impeccable credentials in terms of family, all of the rest. I think his uncle had been Pope. I mean, it's like, if you want somebody who's got all the stuff, the CV, as we like to say nowadays, he wanted it bad. You remember he had been preceded by an individual who was sort of a nice little monk, named Celestine V in papal name. And the rumors were that Boniface, as a cardinal, had sort of said, Celestine, this is God speaking. I have a special message. You are unsuited to be Pope, and I would like for you to resign. Now, this, of course, became a very famous incident against Boniface, and who knows how much is true. You know how sort of like something out of Papal Confidential, and it's like, is that really true? Nobody will ever know, but we do know that this monk / hermit did step down, and you remember that happened a few years back in the Catholic Church. And the idea being that then Boniface said, me? You want me to be Pope? Okay. I've got experience and I just love people who need people, etc. Wherever the case, Boniface VIII had a lot of enemies. And there are political issues here. Whatever the case, Boniface, who will be a very troubling pope, shall we say, and will have a somewhat unpleasant relationship with King Philip IV, even though in 1298 he will have Louis IX canonized. See, I do nice things for you. So, and yet their relationship will be troubling. Meanwhile, the relationship of Pope Boniface with this troubling duo, that is the King of England and the King of France, will be settled according to a scheme he will make up and approve. It's an interesting scheme, particularly because it involves the holy rite of matrimony. Yes, the love connection. Well, sort of, but politics seems to make everything right. And look at these marriages. Edward I was a widower. He really loved his wife. Her name was Eleanor of Castile. Have you ever heard that subway stop in London, Elephant and Castle?
Yeah.
I know. I learned that having a beer pub. I was younger. I know. I was so worldly. I lived a tawdry shingle life. And so I know, but the beer granted me the explanation for Elephant and Castle. I never heard that, but I think that's an interesting explanation. Because why else? Basically, Eleanor Castile was so beloved by the people and by her husband that she was quite honored. But now he was a widower, and Philip IV had an unmarried sister. And Marguerite, I suppose, would be the correct pronunciation. And Edward I had a little fella. That'll be next week. We'll just call him Little Eddie right now. Yeah. He was called a lot of things. But Edward II, he will be. And he's a troubling teen at this point. Let's just put it that way. I mean, we all have problems at that age, but he had a lot of them. And he will be married to, at least in principle, married to the daughter of King Philip. And she's still, I guess we'd say middle school now, junior high. So she's not really ready, but more or less, oh, wow, I'm going to marry the Prince of Wales. Wow, that sounds great. You think so? Boy, do I have a surprise for you. But the idea of marriages are going to solve all these problems. Because once we have love, well, if that had been true, wouldn't you think all these marriages in the past would have solved the problems? But Boniface VIII brings them all together and say, I'm your Pope, and so let's all get married. Except for me. I'm pure, but well, relatively. All of this then is to say that this keeper of the keys here is going supposedly to provide a solution to the problems. And if he does, what does that mean? Well, of course, it means that this French issue will be, quote unquote, solved. Really, say you? Then why do we have the 100 Years' War in a class near you? 1337. Yeah. We always make these plans and sometimes they don't work out, but that was the idea. And you're thinking, what good is this going to do for the Pope? Well, of course, because the Pope is going to be considered the great involver, sort of like peacemaker, arbitrator, that kind of thing. Now, the Pope had lots of other issues, so we'll save that for another time, but we will note that these particular marriages did take place, and he was very happy with, that is, Edward I was very happy with this much younger French woman and had another family by her. So, yeah, so that's a very interesting thing. And you say, oh, well, that's just blessed to hear about this. But the bliss does not continue with the younger generation. Little Eddie and this, now this is awful. The she-wolf of France. Yeah, believe it or not. I know, but that was what they used to say. Isabella, a very interesting character that some of us will remember from the movie. And that was, all of this will take place in the latter years of King Edward the First. Because suddenly, just as we're getting that Scottish campaign moving, yeah. So that will be the end of the reign. It was not an unimportant reign. It was a very important reign. But, you know, it's like you got your father, Henry III, and then you've got RateMyKing.com, Edward II. So you're thinking Edward First is a bright light? Yes, indeed. Very, very bright. And we also note that he had his successes. And I think if you're hanging out in Wales or something and ask them, when we look at the whole Edwardian picture, don't you think Edward had a great effect on Wales? And maybe they'll say yes. We hate him, but we still, but Prince of Wales, maybe someday they'll get it back. I don't know, but not that I notice right now. On the other hand, his accomplishments in the law and the development of the English government is highly significant. And of course, with due credit to Uncle Simon, let's make sure that he gets credit for this summoning of what is called a model parliament, although, as we will see soon enough, the parliament of the future will be a bicameral one and not a tricameral one. Well, thank you all. I've enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you all next time, okay?